So the purpose of this video is to tell you what an NFT is and what it isn't. I'm not getting into the details of how the NFT actually works or anything like that. I'm just trying to describe the function of it and why it's a new thing. Because when I try to look this up, people are usually confusing different ideas and thinking that it does things that it doesn't do, or just hyping it up because maybe they have some NFTs and they want the value to go up or something. Um, so in order to do this, I'm going to walk through first uh, tracking of digital provenance without even using an NFT or decentralization, because I want to just go through an analogy where I say, here's how you would do the tracking of digital provenance on paper without even using a computer. Here's how you would do it with a computer in a centralized way, which is typically how people wrote things before decentralized networks really existed. And then talk about the difference between doing that on a centralized architecture or a decentralized architecture. And I'm not going to get into the actual architecture, just the functional differences between those. Okay, so if we were just going to track provenance on paper with no computer of a digital asset is essentially a string of characters. This becomes very analogous to actually tracking the provenance of a real estate property. Um, Now, the thing that you're tracking there is it's actually ownership of the property, but it's represented with a thing called a legal description, which is actually a string of characters. So a digital asset is a string of characters. So in a sense, I mean, we can definitely use that as an analogy of how we would track this. So first, you'd write down your string of characters, um, and then you would have these deeds that you use to transfer ownership from one person to another. It'd have to start with one person, right? And then every time you add a deed, that deed says the ownership has transferred from this person to this person. Sign off on it as a seller, sign it as the buyer, pay money. There's usually an escrow service in there to make sure that essentially there's a point where you have to verify that the buyer just put their money in and the seller just gave their permission with the signature. Escrow service does that. So once the seller gives permission, you add that deed. A new buyer comes along, you'd add another deed, and you just keep doing that with each buyer. You'd add a deed. So you'd end up with a stack of papers, which are deeds, and the digital asset would just be written down on paper. It'd just be a string that you write, like Jack Dorsey's tweet. It would just be written down on there, and that would track it, right? And there'd be one centralized institution or company that would be sort of the official keeper of these deeds. With properties, it's the county, but it could be any institution or business or whatever entity that you trust. Now, if you were to do it with a computer instead of these written contracts, then you'd have some sort of authentication. The user would log in. They probably have a bank account attached so they could transfer money, and you'd have a database that essentially tracked. Same idea as with the deeds. You'd have the digital asset would be written down in a sense. It'd be recorded as a string, and then associated with that would be the owners. And every time it was bought, you could have essentially a digital deed that said this person just bought from this person, add it to a record, keep adding each time there's a buyer and seller that do a transaction. You just keep adding those. And then you need to trust the person who runs this program and maintains this database. It might be a computer sitting on somebody's desk, and you have to trust that computer and that person are going to be the entity that maintained the provenance on this digital asset. Okay, so now the one thing that changes when you start using a decentralized framework instead of a centralized framework which is what I just described, is only that it's decentralized. That's the only thing that changes. So now instead of trusting an entity to run it on their computer, you've got a network like the Ethereum network, for example, that's running on a bunch of people's computers. Whoever happens to be running the mining of Ethereum is running part of the Ethereum network. And you're not really trusting one entity, you're just sort of trusting that the whole network exists and that it is running correctly. And as long as that is true, now it's going to handle the monetary part, and it's going to handle updating the record in that quote database. I'm not saying it's technically, it's different architecture. It's however it's implemented on the Ethereum network. But essentially, that digital record is getting updated, and it's being done by the network. Now, if you're doing it in a centralized way, yes, there'd still be a computer that's doing it for you. As a person, you wouldn't actually be doing anything. You'd just be letting the computer run. But there would be like one owner of that computer, and that owner could probably go in there and as an admin to the database and change stuff around or something. So you'd have to actually trust that owner. The difference is you don't really have to trust anybody with the decentralized version. But my point is, provenance is nothing new. And when you see one of these digital assets selling for like $1 million, it cannot be simply that provenance made that go up way more in value than it probably would have before these NFTs existed. Right? It's not just the provenance. Yes, the provenance is a critical component, but the only new thing about NFTs is the decentralization. That's it. So there's another layer of trust because there's really no entity in there interfering with it. And one might argue that there's some convenience factors that come into play too when there's no longer an entity or company that's actually in charge and it's just run by this network. But the only true difference is the decentralization. The provenance part, yes, that's what you're buying. You're buying the fact that the provenance tracks that you're the new owner. But there's nothing new about tracking provenance. That's been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So that's it. If you like the video, please like and subscribe, and peace out.